So again, welcome everyone, and I wanted to say thank you to Carnegie Mellon University, Anna, for having me here today and the panel. My name is Brenda Giroux. I'm with Deloitte, and I've been supporting the U.S. Department of Energy for more than 20 years now. The panel is Cybersecurity, AI, and Energy, Evolving Critical Infrastructure while Ensuring a Security Energy Grid. Whether you're a utility, an energy corporation, or one of many stakeholders, the security of our electric grid is paramount to our national security. Tom Siegel earlier emphasized that as well today. Cyber threats are pressing, and preparing for them involves the work of researchers around the globe. Addressing cyber risk in the energy sector is critical, not only to energy security, but it is also vital for a resilient state and economy. During this candid discussion between industry and government, we will hear a variety of perspectives on how we will collectively tackle these issues related to security. Larry Pileggi, Department Head and Tanoto Professor, Electrical and Computer Engineering, Carnegie Mellon University. He has previously held positions at Westinghouse, Research Development, and the University of Texas at Austin. His research interests include various aspects of digital and analog integrated circuit design and design methodologies, and simulation and modeling of electric power systems. He has consulted for various semiconductor and EDA companies, and he co-founded Fabrics, Extreme DA, and Pearl Street Technologies. He is our moderator for today. Mark Miko. With more than 20 years of technology experience, Mark serves as Duquesne's Vice President, Information Technology and Chief Information Officer. In his role, Miko oversees technology, systems infrastructure, and cybersecurity. He is responsible for providing strong leadership and oversight of the company's recent and future technology investment and implementations. This includes directing and managing the company's information technology resources, including infrastructure, architecture, application development, networks, computer and auxiliary operations, and cybersecurity for the enterprise. Dr. Susan Lewis is a lifelong sustainability professional, now working in Wilmington, Delaware, as State Energy Manager for the Army National Guard. She holds a PhD in Energy and Environmental Policy from the University of Delaware, as well as a Master's in Coastal Zone Management and a Master's in Environmental Education, both from Nova Southeastern University in Florida. In her role as State Energy Manager, she develops and oversees all energy resiliency and sustainability-related project design and management. She manages the renewable and conventional energy portfolios, as well as statewide recycling program, EV charging program, and apparently much more. Robert Thornton is President and CEO of the International District Energy Association, an industry association founded in 1909 to advance the use of efficient and sustainable district energy systems in cities, communities, and campuses. In his role since 2000, he represents the interests of over 2,500 IDEA members in 26 countries and serves as principal industry advocate for a more favorable policy and regulatory environment for district energy, CHP, and microgrids. Peter Trellis is the National Business Manager for State and Local Government at Siemens and a fellow at the Center for Neighborhood Technology leading smart city initiatives. His current focus is on smart and resilient cities, smart buildings, IoT, energy production, energy procurement, energy efficiency, and public-private partnerships. He previously held the position of Chief Technology Officer at Siemens Infrastructure and Cities. His portfolio included logistics, aviation, passenger, freight, rail, ports, road, and city mobility. Zico Coulter. Zico is an assistant professor in the Computer Science Department with the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. He is also a member of the Societal Computing Program, and he is an affiliated member of the Machine Learning Development, the Robotics Institute, and the Electrical Computer Engineering Department. Coulter's research focuses on computational approaches to sustainable energy domains, core challenges arising in machine learning, optimization, and control in these areas. Please welcome this panel for today. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to get started today, we're going to take some questions from the audience later, but I have a few here prepared that I thought I'd start with the panel. And just to kind of start with a softball question for some of you, maybe Mark and Susan in particular, how real is the threat of cybersecurity to the energy grid, and are microgrids and national distribution grids equally vulnerable?
I think it's real. To give an example, you know, I run the IT and cyber department for the local utility. You can turn the mic on.
Test. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I think this threat for cybersecurity on the energy grid is very real. I run the IT and cyber department for the local utility, and we're relatively small in size compared to a lot of the national utilities. And just to give you a size and scale, we get about 400 real significant cyber threats a month that my team is actively investigating. So I don't mean the millions of attempts that get blocked, you know, through the technology. I mean something that's actually identified by either a national agency, an energy consortium, as a real cyber threat to our systems and to the grid. So we take that very seriously. We spend a significant amount of hours and time actually making sure we are managing those threats and mitigating all of those threats and risks. So I definitely think the cyber threat is significant.
Susan?
Sure.
You guys hear me? Okay. For the perspective of the military, there's a distinct cybersecurity threat to the grid in the sort of viewpoint of the organization as a whole. And the reactions to that are less specific than I think than your examples were, but for us, we try to deal with that as a more general way by creating secure resiliency and energy security to combat the potential threats that are out there. So there's a lot of effort placed in the Department of Defense, all the way down to the National Guard where I am, on establishing resiliency and energy security to sort of stave off what could be a potential threat down the line or as soon as tomorrow. There's specific programming for that, there's specific funding for that, and the onus is put on energy managers like myself to come up with creative solutions to those sort of large-scale problems. So the specific threats are less obvious in my world, but the preemptive reactions are really where we put the focus.
Does anybody else want to comment?
Oh, somebody hacked my microphone. I'm just kidding. 400 threats a month. That is a lot more than I thought. So, I mean, that's keeping you busy. You know, in our space, so thinking about like universities or healthcare or, you know, mission critical microgrids, you know, I think what they've done is they keep the SCADA system separate, right? It's air gapped from the grid. Only when there's a real-time interaction with the grid, you know, is there conversation. So the universities, including UT Austin, Larry, that has 135 megawatts of generation on campus. It's literally its own microgrid city. You know, they've really taken a lot of steps to protect the research, and in some cases it's hundreds of millions of dollars worth of research flow through these universities. So keeping the lights on, keeping the laboratory mice warm and comfortable is really job one. So the microgrid aspect of universities, I think, is in response to, you know, a lot of other challenges, not just hacking and cybersecurity, but Mother Nature.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Anybody else? Well, just to kind of follow up on that, so I guess no matter what the attack is, if you're a utilities director for a university or a manufacturing facility, what kind of infrastructure investments are you willing to make to enhance the continuity and ensure the resiliency?
So I know that Siemens will probably have some discussion on this, but business continuity is often a factor of risk, right? So what are you protecting and how valuable is it to you? So, again, some of our universities are processing, tens and literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of federal grants each year. They must have, resilient, reliable, efficient systems. So many of them have turned to, in addition to district energy producing heat, chilled water for air conditioning the campus, also combined heat and power cogeneration. So they have, adequate generation on campus nearby. It won't supply 100% of the electricity needs of the campus, but generally, around 80%, and then they'll optimize, those needs for critical loads. So, in short, the university sector, as well as our downtowns, after an event like Superstorm Sandy, they're really turning to cogeneration, district energy, microgrids as a resiliency strategy.
Peter, do you want to add to that and talk maybe about the best practices that are emerging?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Peter. We should put pictures up next to these names. First, just to comment, you're in a room with a vice chancellor, and he said, the grid went down because the municipal utility didn't invest what they needed to be resilient, and I lost $5 million worth of research funding because the things got spoiled. And that's an unacceptable equation. And when we talk to, whether it be military bases or healthcare facilities or all these campuses where you have an aggregated load that lends itself towards a decentralized energy practice, I think we're at the point, especially with battery storage, where the economics are really there just in terms of efficiency and payback. And when you layer on the co-benefits of resiliency, it really becomes almost a no-brainer. And I think you see a huge uptick in the market in those kinds of institutions investing in decentralized energy resources and the corresponding microgrid. What that introduces is a much larger attack surface from a cybersecurity perspective. So while they gain control, they also gain responsibility over making sure that that environment is resilient in terms of physical cybersecurity and not only energy. And we don't track the number of attacks, but what we do see is a really formal, very noticeable uptick in cybersecurity attacks to critical infrastructure. We have Black Energy, we have WannaCry, Titan, Stuxnet, right? We have very, very sophisticated actors coming after the infrastructure, and that's increasing at an alarming rate. And so as you add microgrids, as you add IoT, as you add the complexity of the technology and the integration of all of it and working with the utilities, you really are just increasing the attack surface and the possible attack vectors. So I think the economics of it and the kind of calculus of the investment is becoming a lot clearer in a way that it just wasn't before. Mm-hmm. In terms of best practices, I would say that level of complexity lends itself to another space, and we'll just briefly talk about artificial intelligence here. Traditionally, cybersecurity was about rules, right? Firewall rules, antivirus software, and that's just not enough anymore. You are now being forced to use machine learning and algorithmically detecting anomalies. So cybersecurity is becoming a lot less about rules, although they need to be there, and a lot more about detection and containment of attacks. And so the space is quickly evolving in terms of computer scientists and deep learning playing a role in physical cybersecurity that that it never really has before. But by the simple of nature of what people are doing, that is the best practice. And I think that the second, I would say, best practice would be, at Siemens, we were one of the principal founders of the Charter of Trust, which means companies like Dell or Cisco, other industrial partners coming together to make sure that the entire supply chain is hardened from the energy continuum. And so working together, sharing information, coordinating with different institutions, both on the public, private, and academic side, and even non-for-profits to a certain degree, that networked behavior and realizing that no one entity has the power to really fully address it, I think is the best practice, not only for physical cybersecurity, but a lot of things, including energy resilience.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, Zika's perfect segue for you, I guess. Did you want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, so as everyone does this little dance here.
Yeah,
that seems to be kind of, okay.
You're good.
Good? All right. So yeah, I work extensively in AI as applied to energy systems. And I kind of want to make 2 points on this. The first is that I think, in some sense, these techniques, and they go by all the names of AI and machine learning, or just data-driven analysis of these sensors we have. But this, in some sense, this is the only way we're going to keep up with the volume of data we are currently producing. As we are currently outfitting the grid with more sensing, with more distributed actuation, really it becomes a necessity to transform ourselves from a manually controlled infrastructure to one that is where we do, within reason and within limits, hand over some understanding and control of that to these systems. It's the only way we can deal with the complexity of these domains. And it's ultimately has the potential to vastly improve efficiency, reliability, and robustness of the grid. And so this is, on the whole, has huge potential. The second point, though, that I want to make is that integrating AI into the grid is not without its own risks and challenges, especially from a security standpoint. So it is not at all controversial within the AI community to say that deep learning systems, as they're currently deployed, actively deployed, have major security flaws to them. You can craft inputs to these things in a way which will totally corrupt the desired behavior of the system and essentially make it think that everything's fine when really things are going crazy, or make it think things are going crazy when the system's acting as normal. So in order to achieve the potential of these AI systems as applied to cybersecurity or other domains, we now have another threat vector to consider, which is the actual security of these systems themselves, and that can't be ignored in this whole process.
So, Duquesne Light's ready to do AI for the grid?
We are. I think a couple things. Rob made a good point about the separation of the systems. Our SCADA control monitoring systems being separate from any corporate systems. So that's an important distinction, and targeted investment into the highest priority areas. That separation also gives us the ability to pilot AI in a corporate setting, which is maybe less critical, and prove out that technology and then move it into the SCADA environment or more critical environment as well. I think one of the things, just maybe to hit on policy real quick or regulation, I think one of the things that will be interesting as the technology that Peter talked about and Zico talked about is NERC-CIP regulations. How do they keep up? And right now we are governed and controlled by those regulations in the cybersecurity space for our critical infrastructure, and as things like AI that was talked about migrate into that critical infrastructure space, we find ourselves as the utilities, as I'm sure the manufacturers of that technology, we find ourselves out ahead putting in controls on our own, and then we see the regulation that follow, to kind of govern the security in those areas.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
I think we're largely at a loss right now on how you regulate AI as a whole. This goes well beyond just the grid, of course. You have people like Elon Musk who are deploying some of the most, in some sense, dangerous and safety-critical AI systems, also saying you need to regulate AI somehow. So what this even means, to be honest, is sort of unclear, to me at least, what it would mean to regulate AI. Because AI is a very fuzzy term, to be clear also. It stands for this very broad collection of things that we think of as being intelligent in some way, but it can go from linear regression to these deep networks and control modules. And so the notion of when you say we need to regulate AI, I think everyone agrees with that in principle, is that yes, when you deploy these things into safety critical environments, you need some understanding of how they're going to work, when they're going to work, when they're not going to work. But even people in the field don't really know what that means yet. And so I think a lot more work has to be done to understand what it means to put in place regulations about what an AI system can do or cannot do. Because frankly, right now, there's no even agreed upon definition of what that would even entail. And so I think that it's easy. I mean, everyone agrees we should regulate some things in this space. But I think a lot more work needs to be done before we really understand what that means on a technical level.
And I would add that the regulations are not keeping pace with the markets or the technology, and it's no fault of the regulators. I mean, I think a lot of the things we discuss as an industry are not, the issues aren't capital, they're not technology, they're not engineering, it's really the rules. And whether it's, access to data, I mean, this is one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of like technology innovators, is that the customer data is owned by the utility and not available, and rightly so, right? So who owns whose data, and how do they get access to it so that we can all kind of work smarter, faster? I think that's one of the sort of regulatory paradigms that needs discussion.
Yeah, I think that the utility owning the customer data is a result of consumerism and the utility commission's attempt to protect marketing activities and those kinds of things from the customer. And I think you bring up a good point. We now start to have to challenge that and say, is that relinquishing of the customer data ownership from the utility going to be beneficial to some of those other technology providers, some of those other manufacturers of grid equipment and those kinds of things, to actually increase the reliability of the grid and make the energy services more reliable? So do we get to a point where giving up ownership of that information is benefiting us in other ways that outweigh the marketing calls and the consumerism and those kinds of things? And again, we're not. I think we're on board with that. I don't think that we have a vested interest in protecting that information if it's helping people in the ultimate in reliability of the system. Meter data is another one that we talk a lot about. All the utilities pretty much have rolled out smart meters across their entire network. And the access to that data, not only the customer data, but more of the energy flow data, the reliability data, those kinds of things are now accessible via those meters. And we often get caught in regulation in freeing up access to that information. It's not necessarily that the utility doesn't want to free up that access. It's more around, as you said, what are the rules that we have to follow? And do they limit some of that technology deployment, some of that innovation, and some of that sharing of data for the ultimate better of the reliability of the grid?
Well, we have an industry, though, that we have data that doesn't always have timestamp information, and it's trying to be shared across large regions, and sometimes utilities and ISOs that are not comfortable with even doing planning simulations in the cloud. So how do we get how do we move forward toward this larger goal? Anybody want to take that?
Well, I mean, I think it needs to be adjudicated, probably at a state level. I mean, if you talk about ISOs, though, that's not a state level, right? That's regional. So then you right away you have a jurisdictional problem. Is it regional? Is it FERC? Is it a state? I mean, I don't think anybody wants their utility to be Facebook, right? And hand over unwittingly all your data. But I think there are actors in the space that if they could look at the data and support more value-added, sort of even locational marginal pricing decisions, right, for location of microgrids in a congested area. Right now, that takes an act of Congress or more to get that type of data. So, I don't blame the utilities. I think it's the world we kind of reside in right now. And Larry, I don't have a short and clever answer for that, other than we've got to work at it.
Sure. Any other comments? No other solutions? Okay. Well, I got one for you, Susan. What are some of the solutions to the increasingly unreliable grid, and how do we account for the different needs of a variety of organizations? I'm sure the military is very different than that of a bank or a university.
Yeah, I imagine that's true. I haven't worked for banks or in all those different areas, but I can speak for the military. Grid reliancy has become really a hot ticket item and a major area of concern. We have, a couple years ago, a directive came out for the Army, the entire Army, all of it, the entire Department of the Army. It was a very simple directive that simply dictated that we are to achieve 14 days of energy independence across all facilities, all garrisons, all campus, everything. And that's a pretty hefty demand and goal to achieve. It was not accompanied by any sort of funding or a directive or guidance rather, but more of just a, hey, go figure this out. Now, there's for a long time been regulation and funding support for backup generation, usually in the form of propane or diesel. But we really want to move away from that for a laundry list of reasons. So we had the energy security in that regard already sort of established, but now things have really moved rapidly into a much different direction, or a more expanded direction anyway. So microgrids are really where a lot of us energy managers are going, because no matter how many backup generators you've got, no matter how many gallons of diesel you've got in a tank somewhere, no matter how many solar panels and batteries and whatever, I mean, you can achieve 14 days of energy capacity, but to have the independence, you have to be able to disconnect from the grid, which effectively is then a microgrid. So that's what a lot of us are working on to enable that. Another sort of interesting sort of anecdote, if you will, about the military, which is unique, I think, is that unlike banks and even residential environments or, for the most part, what's really unique is that for the military, if we're in what I'm going to call a resiliency mode, if we're in a situation where we do need to activate a microgrid or have an emergency response, our facilities are operating not at 50% or something. They're operating at 120%, give or take, because it's all hands on deck. We need to be doing something. So there's a lot of additional factors for us to consider to achieve those goals and truly be mission ready for an extended period of time as a result of all the different types of threats that there could be.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So,
Larry, if I could just add, so a lot of times, like resiliency should be you're able to bounce back from an event, right? But then autonomy, which is I think your directive, is even that much more challenging. And so sometimes it's the physical systems, but sometimes it's really just the game plan, right? Emergency preparedness. One of our members runs the district energy system that serves the Texas Medical Center, which is 19 million square feet, the largest healthcare campus in the world, 6 hospitals. So Hurricane Harvey happened, right? They were ready, but they had to feed, 50 people for literally 10 days. They had everyone living on cots. They had a plan when, and the good news about a hurricane is you can kind of see it coming, but there are operational, issues that go into it too, particularly, with the military and readiness. So often it's not just asset, it's personnel too, which is a big challenge.
I think what we see at Siemens is a real need for community energy planning. So I'll give you two examples. So we're assisting in Puerto Rico after the impact there, and give you an example of a town where a lot of the manufacturing plants had invested a lot in decentralized energy resources and microgrids so that they would be up and running in case of an event. Well, because the schools and the police station and nothing else was secured, their plants were up and running, but nobody could get to work. And so they realized that they needed a holistic community energy plan in order to get that going, because they have enough generation to be able to provide energy security for the anchor institutions that the community relies on to be able to get the city back up and running. Today we have probably one of the most advanced projects of its kind in the world going on in Brownsville, Illinois with ComEd, where the utility is providing generation, decentralized generation assets for a medical institution, then realizing that the academic institution actually already had generation power and had its own microgrid, and that is being converted into a mini grid or a grid of grids with a two-way communication, if you will, so that if one of the microgrids needs power or one of the microgrids needs something else, you can take from one anchor institution to the other, and then the supporting important places like, let's say, a police station or a fire station that would be needed in case of an unplanned event are also supported, because there is enough capacity there to bring some of those assets online. And looking at it from a community perspective and working with the utility and working with those institutions, it's that full holistic plan, I think, that is really going to give us the kind of resilience that we're looking for in energy security, especially whether it be a cyber attack or a natural disaster or some other unplanned event.
Yeah, thank you. Anna, did we have questions from the audience?
We actually have a lot of questions.
Okay, so I won't take up any more time with my questions, but go ahead.
So a question that's come in, AI is based on reliable data coming from SCADA systems. How do you see AI becoming implemented into industry when data might be compromised? So how do the two work together?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is definitely true that as a data-driven system, these techniques are limited by, to a certain extent, fundamentally, by the quality of the data that's input into them. You can't really get around this. If you have complete noise for your data and no one tells you this, it's not going to do anything useful. That being said, along with kind of deployment time robustness, there's a whole line of work in machine learning on dealing with robustness in terms of adversarially manipulated training data too. So if training data comes in, some sizable but still minority fraction of your training data is corrupted in some way, even adversarially corrupted to try to maximally fool you, there are techniques that can enable the system to still learn the correct decision nonetheless. And essentially, these work more or less by considering, maybe without getting into too much in details, they consider kind of different losses about what you're what kind of model they're trying to fit. Instead of trying to making a model that fits all the data, you actually allow for errors in your model fitting. And so when you do this, you actually allow for errors in the portion of your model that captures the adversarial, the misspecified inputs. And this actually just goes a long way towards enabling you to account for adversarially manipulated training data. Now, a lot more work needs to be done in this area. We are not there yet, especially for the more complex algorithms we're really deploying in the world. This is still largely an unexplored area. But these basic ideas actually go a long way back to statistics and robust statistics that have been around for hundreds of years, if not 100 years, if not longer. And so there is work there. So I think this notion that AI can only work with perfect data is also a mischaracterization of the current state of the art. But of course, much more work needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add, SCADA systems are designed to be industrial grade software. There's a reason they're not allowed typically to touch other things, because the engineering processes that are required to develop a SCADA system and make sure that the data is reliable and is the right data, because you're controlling people's lives, is something that is typically unknown. So it's, you can't just turn the computer on and off, right? A SCADA system that's running a train system, the reliability requirements aren't even 5 nines or 6 or 7 nines, they're 10 to the minus 12. That's one failure for every billion hours of operation, and it highly relies on the integrity and the quality of the data. So I think you're already working with a safer than normal input set, but of course there's still work to be done to make sure that it's safe.
Okay.
So it's very difficult sometimes for researchers to get access to systems data for reasons discussed by the panel. So how much is this holding up progress? Could we be making more progress if more data was made available to researchers?
Anybody want to answer that one? Or everybody want to answer that one? I know Zico wants to answer that.
Yes, I think so. And I think this is what it comes down to. This is sort of a matter of incentives, right? Is that the way it's been traditionally viewed, the risks associated with data breaches, rightfully so, I think, have tended to outweigh the potential benefits that utilities often see in releasing their data. Because the benefits are kind of this abstract, well, maybe we'll find something to make it work better, but the risks are very concrete. We have certain regulations and laws around the release of this data. So I think the solution there has to come from both a applied standpoint, which actually means that universities actually need to change a little bit and be more okay with maybe more stringent requirements for data access, and more, willing to sign more documents affirming that we're not going to do bad things with this data. But then also on the flip side, I think there needs to be more regulation that governs kind of the viable release of data, because ultimately, if we can share data, not just between industry and universities, but across industry, across universities, the more we can do this, the more we can sort of gain critical mass in the thinking about these problems. And changes, I think, need to be made on both sides. Both the people that have that data need to have be better incentivized to release it, and the units that want access to this data, we need to be more flexible about the terms that we can accept, and not just say, it has to be all open, whatever we do with it has to be completely, everything has to be okay. There is critical data, and there's data that you can't release, and this has to be addressed from all sides, I think.
I agree, and I think there's also committees that are pulled together to establish these rules and regulations, and I would encourage the research community and the universities to be part of that and join on those boards and those committees with the utilities and the owners of the data. And I think, Zico, you make a great argument, and I just don't see anybody showing up to those forums and those bodies that build the regulation, from the research space.
I think he's talking, well, can you explain what the threat is with this data? So let's say you're talking about measurement data or something like that?
Well, I understand the question to be around, if we were going to release SCADA data and control data that we're using to control the grid with,
yeah.
What constraints come with that?
Right, but how real is that threat? And then we could talk about the other aspect, which is, I think Zico's constraints are that the university wants it to be freely publishable work that is derived from it.
Well,
so
part of the challenge is, a very important critical infrastructure component of the data is a simple concept, even IP addresses. So if I was to give the researchers a data dump of our SCADA system, It would involve, the
Right.
critical identifier such as an IP address. And if that was breached on the researcher's side, not on the utility side, it creates us, very, very susceptible to.
Right, but I don't think Zico needs that IP addresses. That's why I think.
Yeah. So I think a lot of this, and to be clear, I actually don't want to. There's plenty of regulations that allow for publishable research in the abstract while not releasing, of course, the data that is used for the experiments. There's lots of precedent for that.
Right.
But it's often still sort of this, for lack of a better term, this adversarial battle, it's seen as, where the push from the research side is always to get more access and more release, and then the push from the other side is always to sort of maintain it. I think one of the tools that could make a huge difference here, honestly, is more work in understanding anonymization and privacy-preserving aspects of data analysis. So this is actually a field that also is gaining quite a bit of attention in machine learning. How do you analyze a data set without releasing critical information about that data set? So not having the IP address, because you're right, we don't need that. We may not need the exact grid layout that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could be used against it. But there is a large middle ground here where there's valuable data that can be used to demonstrate and prove out AI applications for energy systems that could be valuable while not releasing huge amounts of data. So I think there is a middle ground, and it's both a research and a policy challenge to get there.
Yeah, and I agree. My point was that we need some more definition around that.
Yeah.
And today the way that the rules are written, it's pretty vague. And I'll take my compliance office as an example. At our utility, is if we were to release any SCADA data, any SIP critical infrastructure data, we're self-reporting that. We're talking about a SIP violation. We're talking about that leading to fines, for the utility. So we're scared. So you're right. We protect it, like it's our firstborn, and don't let any aspects of it leak and go anywhere, because again, the regulations are written to be interpreted that way by our compliance office. So I think it's that greater definition that needs to happen. It's that involvement from the research community in defining those standards and those regulations, so that it is clear what is able to be shared and what can't be shared.
Yeah, Anna, is there time for one more question?
I think just one more. There's a lot of questions about specifics with microgrids and blockchain and the cloud and all these different, there's so many different directions that we could go with this. If there was one thing that you would want for us to know in 30 seconds or so, what would it be? What should we be thinking about and planning for?
I will say we do have a blockchain project in Brooklyn, which you can look on online, and Sharing Energy. So for those of you who are interested in that, please check it out. One of the biggest impediments that we have is the inconsistent regulation in terms of decentralized energy, microgrids, cybersecurity. We have public utility commissions, public service commissions. They can't even agree on what to call themselves. And they're certainly not agreeing on policy. So for us to have a market, for us to have critical scale and investment, we need less friction for deal flow, for innovation. And that's not going to happen if I have 50 different ways to do things and I have to go on an Easter egg hunt every time I go into a different market.
So I'll echo that. So I also am involved with the Microgrid Resources Coalition, and for the past 4 years we've been providing testimony at FERC, as well as Pennsylvania, DC, New York Rev, most recently Hawaii. And it is a patchwork of really regulatory paradigm. But I'll say this: I think what's the cliche? The arc of something bends towards justice. I think the arc of energy is bending towards decentralized options. I really think we're moving in that direction, and it's accelerating. Community scale options for military and mission critical and cities, campuses, etc. That's where the game is.
Okay. Any last 15-second thought from anybody? Okay.
I have a 15-second thought. Just one final anecdotal comment to anybody here from industry or students who are going to graduate at some point and be in the industry or what have you. The Department of Defense has a program. The acronym is ESTCP. It stands for Environmental Something 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 Program. And I'm sure you can look it up, and the Google machine will know what it is, even though I don't remember it because we have a lot of acronyms to remember. But anyway, the point is, that program is it's a demo program. It's Department of Defense funding for specific types of programs that are meant to be demonstrative and scalable. There's a number of them out there right now this year alone that are microgrid specific, I think 3 different ones among many others. I'm working on one right now that's the specific sort of angle on the microgrid is utility partner, like a private-public partnership sort of thing. So we're the public, if you will, partner, and utilities private. But anyway, there's many other ones. There's a lot of, we were talking about best practices before. We haven't identified them all yet. And there's money out there and there's interest out there in finding out what the best practices are. So I just wanted to sort of let everybody know that.
Thank you. All right, if we could thank the panel once again.
Thank you, everyone.